The Medusa Touch wasn't just another supernatural thriller. It was a quiet catastrophe disguised as a film, waiting to strike from the mind of a man who never wakes. It entered 1978 like a bad prediction unfolding in real time. Too restrained to be dismissed, too unnerving to ignore. Its production wrestled with rewrites, erratic effects, and a leading performance so unsettling the crew questioned what they were really capturing. And at the center of it all stood a cathedral collapse that felt less like cinematic illusion and more like evidence of something grim. Why did this story blur so easily into reality? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about the Medusa Touch. Fact 1. The novel that carried a sense of impending catastrophe. The story of the Medusa Touch began long before cameras rolled, inside a novel that felt less like fiction and more like a coded warning. Peter Van Greenaway wrote his book during a cultural moment gripped by fear. Unexplained aviation accidents, collapsing structures, violent uprisings, and a public newly obsessed with the possibility that human thought might influence physical events. Readers who encountered the novel in 1973 often remarked that it echoed reality too closely. Instead of supernatural theatrics, Greenaway delivered a protagonist whose bitterness seemed capable of reshaping the world around him, as if malice alone were a geological force. Producers who first read the manuscript experienced the same discomfort. They expected a thriller. What they found felt like a psychological autopsy of a man whose inner violence had nowhere left to go but outward. Early studio notes reveal hesitation. Executives questioned whether audiences would accept a villain who hardly moves, who never shouts, who doesn't even appear conscious for much of the story. But the restraint was the point. Greenaway's vision suggested that destruction did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears as silence, as stillness, as a mind withdrawing so deeply into itself that the world begins to fracture in response. Director Jack Gold saw potential where others saw risk. He recognized that the novel's unease didn't come from paranormal mechanics, but from the suggestion that hatred could outlive the body that contains it. That insight shaped the film's entire tone. Gold insisted on treating the narrative as grounded realism, refusing to soften Morlar into a tragic figure or exaggerate events for shock value. Yet the very qualities that intrigued him also created tension within the adaptation. The film that would emerge carried not just the plot of the novel, but its strange sense of inevitability, as though catastrophe had already begun, and the cameras were merely capturing its aftershocks. And as production advanced, that uneasy feeling began creeping into the filmmaking process itself. Fact 2. Richard Burton's casting changed the film's entire gravity. Long before audiences saw Richard Burton lying immobile beneath hospital lights, the film's producers debated endlessly about who could portray John Morlar. Burton was not the first name discussed. Studio executives favored actors who projected vitality, charisma, or the kind of theatrical intensity that could anchor a thriller, but Morlar required none of those things. He needed to radiate menace without movement, presence without performance, hostility without a single overt display. Every candidate failed that test until Burton. When Burton finally read the script, he recognized something in Morlar's psyche that resonated with his own artistic impulses. He understood that the character's power came not from physical action, but from emotional density. His approach to the role was unsettlingly internal. Even during rehearsals, when dialogue was not required, Burton held an expression so vacant and controlled that crew members found themselves speaking in hushed tones around him. His stillness disrupted the natural rhythm of the set. People moved differently, breathed differently, as if afraid to disturb whatever space Burton had collapsed into. Makeup artists later described the experience of preparing Burton for coma scenes as profoundly strange. He hardly reacted to brushes or prosthetics, maintaining a distant composure that felt less like concentration and more like withdrawal. Technicians checking monitors noticed that shots containing Burton often appeared darker or heavier, though the lighting setup had not changed. A camera operator joked, "He absorbs the frame," but the remark carried unease more than humor. Burton's physical immobility, a necessity for Morlar, became a metaphor for the film's tension. He was the silent storm center around which every other performance orbited. Ventura, Remick, and the supporting cast adapted their rhythms to match his oppressive calm. Scenes tightened, pacing slowed, and the tone shifted into something more clinical, more suffocating. Burton didn't simply play Morlar. He created a gravitational field that pulled the film inward. And as the shoot progressed, it became clear that his presence would shape more than performance. It would influence the atmosphere of the entire production, especially once accidents started occurring with unnerving frequency. Fact 3. The chain of accidents that made the crew uneasy. Accidents happen on film sets all the time. Cables fail, bulbs burn out, equipment misfires. But what troubled the crew of the Medusa Touch was not the accidents themselves, but their pattern. The first incident seemed trivial, a camera jammed during a routine flashback setup. The second arrived minutes later, when a lighting rig flickered violently without any change in voltage. Both were dismissed as coincidence until the third failure occurred during a scene directly tied to Morlar's destructive past, then a fourth, then a fifth, each malfunction aligning disturbingly with the film's thematic beats. Effects technicians began keeping informal notes, recording when and where disruptions occurred. The data showed nothing conclusive, but the timing was enough to unsettle even the most rational crew members. A scaffolding plank snapping under a stunt coordinator's foot was the moment humor evaporated. Safety checks revealed no structural weakness. The plank should not have broken, yet it had. And it had done so during a rehearsal related to one of Morlar's catastrophe visions. Superstitions emerged quietly. A makeup assistant avoided entering the coma room set alone. A sound technician refused to power up equipment until Burton was positioned. A camera operator claimed that playback monitors distorted whenever Burton appeared fully in frame, though the distortion vanished the moment the angle changed. No one seriously believed the film's narrative was bleeding into reality, but anxiety thrives in patterns, and the Medusa Touch offered just enough of them to unsettle the staff. Some grip crew labeled the production jinxed. Others spoke of bad timing, bad energy, or Morlar's mood. The unease grew strongest when discussions turned to the film's most ambitious sequence, a cathedral collapse that would test the limits of miniature engineering and push the production into its most dangerous territory yet. Fact 4. The director who tried to control a film that kept slipping away. Jack Gold accepted the Medusa Touch, believing it would be a cerebral thriller, something grounded, methodical, almost procedural. But once production began, he realized he had stepped into a project far less manageable than he expected. Gold built his reputation on precision and restraint. He favored small emotional detonations over large cinematic ones. Yet this story required him to stage destruction while preserving psychological subtlety, a contradiction that created friction between his instincts and the studio's demands. Executives pushed for spectacle, urging him to amplify the paranormal elements. Gold resisted, insisting that the horror lay not in explosions but in implication, the quiet possibility that a single mind could erode reality. His refusal to sensationalize the material caused repeated clashes in production meetings. One executive complained the script felt too still, to which Gold replied, "Stillness can be violent." As shooting progressed, Gold became increasingly protective of the film's tone. Crew members noticed him revising scenes in isolation, rethinking camera placements, and trimming dialogue to sharpen the story's cold edge. His intensity trickled down into the environment. Conversations softened, movements slowed. Even the lighting team adjusted their habits, treating each setup with a kind of reverence Gold never explicitly requested. But controlling tone doesn't mean controlling circumstances. Equipment behaved unpredictably, schedules drifted, and Gold, usually composed, began showing signs of strain not from external pressure, but from immersion in a narrative defined by fatalism. He once told a script supervisor, "This film wants to collapse inward. My job is to keep its shape." Ironically, it was the sequence he guarded most, the cathedral collapse that threatened to wrest the film from his hands entirely, becoming the centerpiece of both his ambition and his anxiety. Fact 5. The script that survived studio, demands, and creative doubt. Before cameras rolled, the script endured a turbulent evolution that nearly derailed the film's identity. Early drafts leaned heavily into psychological ambiguity, but studio executives grew uneasy with a story that offered no clear villain, no resolution, and no explanation for Morlar's abilities. They wanted structure, rules, and a more digestible narrative. What they received instead was an internal labyrinth, a character study disguised as a disaster film. Revisions were ordered. Writers attempted to soften Morlar, giving him sympathetic motivations. Gold rejected these versions, arguing that morality diluted the central thesis, destruction for its own sake. Other drafts introduced elaborate scientific theories to justify Morlar's power, but Gold dismissed these attempts as reducing mystery to pseudoscience. "The unknown is scarier," he insisted. The studio's most dramatic suggestion, however, was to remove the cathedral sequence entirely. They feared the scale, the cost, and the controversy it might provoke. Gold refused. Without that moment, he argued, the story would lack a physical expression of Morler's internal violence. It was not spectacle, it was character. Ultimately, the script that survived was a fragile compromise, neither fully commercial nor fully experimental. But the tension between visions produced something unique, a thriller that feels both expansive and claustrophobic, driven by personal rage, yet framed as procedural mystery. By the time the final draft emerged, it carried bruises from every battle fought over it. And those bruises became part of its texture, influencing performances, pacing, and the film's uncanny tone. Yet nothing tested the script's ambition more than bringing its largest catastrophe to life, a sequence so convincing it became a burden the production would carry long after filming ended. Fact 6. The cathedral collapse that looked too real for anyone's comfort. The cathedral collapse stands as the Medusa Touch's most unforgettable image, a moment of destruction executed with such precision that audiences questioned whether they were witnessing fiction at all. The effects team built an unusually heavy miniature, using dense materials to mimic the weight and brittleness of stone. Gold insisted on this physical authenticity, believing that only real mass could produce the proper emotional impact. When the demolition triggered, the result exceeded expectations in unsettling ways. The miniature didn't simply fall, it disintegrated with a frightening sense of inevitability. Dust surged outward like a tidal wave. Chunks of simulated masonry struck the ground with force that startled even seasoned crew members. Playback revealed a collapse that looked eerily documentary, as though the camera had captured a real event rather than a controlled effect. During early screenings, several viewers panicked, convinced they were watching footage of an actual disaster. Religious groups questioned whether the production had violated ethical lines. Journalists accused the film of exploiting tragedy. Even the studio, initially skeptical of the scene's inclusion, grew alarmed by the public reaction. Gold defended the sequence, insisting its realism was essential to the story's emotional weight, but the unintended consequence was that the scene overshadowed the rest of the film. Critics fixated on it, censors scrutinized it, and the production's already tense atmosphere deepened under the scrutiny. The collapse became the film's signature and its most controversial legacy. But controversy was far from over. The reaction to the cathedral scene set off a chain of scrutiny that would follow the cast and crew into subsequent stages of production, especially as the public grew increasingly uneasy with the film's thematic echoes of real-world disasters. Fact 7. The public backlash began before the film even reached audiences. Long before the Medusa Touch arrived in cinemas, it was already provoking unease. Rumors circulated within industry circles that the film contained a destruction sequence so disturbingly lifelike that internal test viewers struggled to separate effect from event. These whispers reached religious groups, architectural organizations, and even municipal safety boards, who demanded clarification. How had the production recreated the collapse of a sacred structure with such fidelity? And more importantly, should they have? Tabloids seized the speculation. Headlines accused the filmmakers of recklessness, claiming the imagery might re-traumatize viewers who had lived through real disasters. Studio spokespeople scrambled to correct misconceptions, reassuring the public that no building had been harmed and the sequence was executed with miniatures. The reassurance didn't calm everyone. Some insisted the footage looked too authentic to be artificial, a comment that both pleased and unnerved the effects team. At advanced screenings, the reaction intensified. A handful of viewers exited the theater during the collapse, unable to stomach its stark realism. Others remained but reported a sense of physical tension, as though witnessing something they were not meant to see. Rather than sensationalism, the discomfort stemmed from the scene's documentary quality, a collapse stripped of spectacle, presented as matter-of-fact devastation. Studio executives briefly considered trimming the sequence, but Gold resisted fiercely. To him, the collapse was not optional spectacle, it was the film's pivotal emotional revelation. The moment Morler's worldview tears into reality. The backlash, however, marked a turning point. A film intended as a slow-burn thriller now carried an aura of controversy, raising questions not about special effects, but about responsibility. And that scrutiny would soon shift toward the film's most enigmatic performer. Fact 8. Richard Burton's stillness created an atmosphere no one anticipated. Burton's performance as John Morlar has often been praised for its restraint, but the impact of that restraint on the set was far more profound than the final film reveals. Because Morlar spends much of the story in a coma, Burton chose to inhabit a state that blurred the line between presence and absence. This created an uncanny emotional gravity. Actors accustomed to dynamic exchanges found themselves speaking into a void that somehow felt aware. Crew members described unexpected reactions. A lighting technician said Burton's motionless face made him hesitant to adjust equipment, as though any disturbance might provoke something dormant. A boom operator recalled moments when Burton's breathing seemed to vanish, prompting him to check whether the actor had drifted into genuine unconsciousness. Even between takes, Burton maintained a stillness that bordered on ritual, explaining only that it kept the temperature of the character. This immersive minimalism affected the tone of entire scenes. Opposite Burton, Lee Remick's performance grew tighter, more brittle, as though absorbing the tension his silence radiated. Lino Ventura later admitted that playing a detective forced to interrogate someone who does not respond challenged him psychologically. Burton's unwavering stillness felt like a wall that absorbed energy rather than reflecting it. The more the cast adapted to Burton's approach, the more pronounced the film's claustrophobic mood became. Gold welcomed the transformation, recognizing that Morlar's presence needed to dominate even when he was physically inactive. What he did not anticipate was how deeply Burton's performance would shape the crew's perception of the story, or how that atmosphere would intensify once production incidents began piling up in unsettling patterns. Burton's stillness became the film's heartbeat, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. Fact 9. The plane crash sequence nearly became a catastrophe of its own. Though the cathedral collapse receives most of the attention, the film's miniature plane crash posed the greatest technical risk. The effects team constructed a scaled aircraft fitted with pyrotechnics to simulate an in-flight ignition. Miniature aviation shots demand absolute precision. Even minor deviations in timing or airflow can upend the entire setup. The initial test confirmed those fears. When the detonation triggered, the flame expanded with unexpected violence, melting part of the support rig and filling the effects stage with smoke thick enough to halt operations for hours. Safety inspectors later concluded that the reaction behaved inconsistently with projected burn patterns, while the official explanation cited material sensitivity. The incident fed into the already growing perception that the production was jinxed. Crew members who previously laughed off mishaps began noting the correlation between them and scenes linked to Morlar's destructive visions. Despite concerns, Gold insisted on reshooting the scene, emphasizing that the plane's trajectory needed to feel disturbingly real. His commitment placed enormous pressure on the effects team, who approached the second attempt with near-military discipline. This time, the detonation unfolded as planned, a controlled arc of destruction rendered with chilling credibility. However, the realism proved to be a double-edged sword. Regulatory boards in several countries raised alarms, questioning whether such footage could appear in marketing materials without causing public distress. One broadcaster refused to air trailers containing even a brief glimpse of the crash, claiming it evoked memories of national tragedies. The sequence ultimately made it into the film intact, but its creation left a lingering anxiety across the set. For some crew members, it was the moment they stopped viewing the production as merely challenging and began seeing it as unnervingly aligned with the disasters it depicted. Fact 10. Lee Remick performed calmness. While filming under real psychological strain, Lee Remick's role as Dr. Zonfeld required a poised exterior, a character trained to assess trauma, dissect fear, and remain collected in the presence of human suffering. But the Medusa Touch challenged that composure in ways the script never acknowledged. Sharing scenes with Burton, who embodied Morlar with unsettling stillness, forced Remick into a state of constant emotional recalibration. She later revealed that acting beside someone who appeared to be thinking without moving triggered an instinctive tension she struggled to suppress. The environment around her didn't help. Equipment failures, sudden changes in lighting, and odd noises during sensitive scenes amplified the atmosphere of unpredictability. One day, a wooden rack of medical props collapsed behind her during a take, startling the entire set. Although no one was hurt, the moment rattled Remick deeply. Gold considered using the footage because of its authenticity, but she requested it be discarded, not for vanity, but because the fear was real, not performed. These accumulated experiences seeped naturally into her portrayal. Remek's character often speaks softly, as though measuring the weight of each word. That quietness wasn't stylistic flourish, it reflected her attempt to maintain equilibrium in an environment that felt subtly hostile. Crew members noticed her growing introspection. Between takes, she often stepped away from the lights, grounding herself before returning to the scene. Rather than resisting the tension, she channeled it, allowing her performance to mirror the film's psychological unease. Her ability to maintain control became essential. Without her stability, the film risked spiraling into melodrama. Instead, her restraint provided the emotional counterbalance needed to anchor Morlar's destructive presence. Yet even her composure couldn't dispel the sense that something stranger was unfolding, a suspicion that crystallized around one unsettling prop. Fact 11. Morlar's prop notebook became an unintentional source of mystery. Morlar's journal was originally conceived as a straightforward prop, a physical extension of his worldview, filled with notes reflecting paranoia, resentment, and cryptic reflections on human frailty. The art department produced a series of handwritten pages, perfectly aligned with the script, but halfway through filming, something unexpected emerged. Several pages that no one claimed responsibility for creating. These newly discovered entries differed in tone and detail. They described events not present in the script and contained peculiar predictions that mirrored scenes yet to be filmed. References to falling structures and "the moment the sky fractures" unsettled the continuity staff, who had never approved or even seen such additions. Handwriting analysis proved inconclusive. No member of the art department recognized the strokes, and no actor admitted adding material as a joke. Gold, instead of being alarmed, allowed the pages to remain, believing they enriched the character's psychological depth. But among the crew, the discovery became a whispered point of fascination and discomfort. Some suggested a production assistant had played an elaborate prank, though the consistency of the writing style contradicted that theory. Others believed a misfiled notebook had accidentally been incorporated into the prop, but that explanation failed to address the uncanny thematic parallels. The strangest detail surfaced days later. The ink on the mysterious pages appeared freshly smeared, though the notebook had supposedly remained untouched. One crew member refused to handle it afterward. The notebook's origin was never resolved, and the unanswered questions around it fed directly into the film's next major uncertainty: how to end a story that resisted closure. Fact 12. The ending that was rewritten to preserve the film's unsettling ambiguity. The finale of the Medusa Touch is remembered for a single sound, the faint pulse monitor beep that transforms Morlar's death into a question rather than an answer. But that ending was not part of the original plan. Early drafts concluded definitively, with Morlar dying and the narrative ending in clinical finality. Gold found the resolution hollow. He believed the story demanded ambiguity, a sense that Morlar's influence extended beyond his physical form. Studio executives resisted the idea. They argued that audiences needed closure and feared that an unresolved ending might weaken the film's commercial appeal. The debate dragged on so long that the production reached Morlar's final hospital scenes without a confirmed ending. Editors anxiously awaited guidance, aware that the finale would dictate the film's entire emotional resonance. Gold proposed a solution. Rather than show continued destruction, suggest it through sound. The pulse monitor, a symbol of bodily persistence, would flicker back to life just as the audience accepted Morlar's death. The ambiguity would be complete. Was it supernatural survival, metaphorical continuation, or simple malfunction? No answer would be given. The studio, surprisingly, embraced the idea. It required minimal resources, yet carried enormous symbolic weight. Test audiences reacted strongly. Some found the moment chilling, others frustrating. But the one reaction Gold feared, indifference, never occurred. In preserving uncertainty, the film earned its enduring mystique, and the ending's power would influence not only fan interpretations, but decades of discussion about Morlar's true nature. Fact 13. The makeup team confronted an unsettling kind of stillness. Preparing Richard Burton for Morlar's coma scenes seemed simple on paper: minimal prosthetics, pale toning, and subtle contour to suggest a body suspended between life and death. In practice, it became one of the production's most unnerving routines. Burton approached the process with a near-monastic quietness. He sat rigidly, eyes closed, breathing controlled, refusing to speak unless absolutely necessary. Makeup artists, accustomed to lively conversation during prep, found themselves working in an atmosphere that felt more like a morgue than a film set. One artist recalled that Burton would occasionally hold his breath for long stretches, forcing her to step back and watch his chest for movement. Another described the discomfort of brushing pigment across skin that seemed to cool beneath her touch, a sensation she later admitted was likely her imagination, though she couldn't shake the memory. Even the prosthetic team grew uneasy when the hospital bed lighting hit Burton's face. It flattened his features into something eerily mask-like, as though the character had absorbed the man beneath. The silence surrounding Burton became contagious. Crew members lowered their voices when entering the room, and several avoided looking directly at him unless necessary. Ventura once joked that Burton had achieved the most intimidating performance ever delivered without opening an eye, but the humor couldn't dispel the tension. Gold tried to normalize the atmosphere, reminding everyone that Burton's approach was a disciplined technique, not an omen. Yet even he admitted that the effect of the actor's stillness extended far beyond performance. It shifted the emotional climate of the set, subtly amplifying the film's themes of isolation and internal violence. The deeper Burton sank into Morler's catatonic state, the more the production felt like it was orbiting a void, and that void would soon echo through an event outside the script, one that unsettled the crew in ways they struggled to explain. Fact 14. A real evacuation mirrored the script with uncomfortable precision. Midway through filming, the cast and crew arrived on location to find the neighboring building sealed off by emergency services. Engineers had identified structural instability that required immediate evacuation. No collapse occurred, but the timing unnerved everyone. The day's scenes revolved around Morler, describing intrusive visions of falling structures, fiction suddenly intersecting with reality. Crew members exchanged glances rather than jokes. The coincidence felt too pointed, too aligned with the story's obsession with catastrophic potential. One assistant director later admitted he briefly considered postponing the day's shoot, fearing the event would cast a psychological shadow over the set. Gold dismissed these concerns outwardly, but privately acknowledged the strange synchronicity. Later that afternoon, a separate incident compounded the unease. A prop van used for transporting equipment experienced unexpected brake failure and rolled backward into a lamppost. No injuries occurred, but the mishap intensified existing anxiety. Technicians, normally pragmatic, began attributing the string of occurrences to the film's mood. Ventura, who filmed key scenes that day, described the atmosphere as charged with a quiet dread. His performance took on a sharper edge, reflecting not only the detective's skepticism but also the actor's own discomfort with the events unfolding around them. Remick, meanwhile, withdrew into focused professionalism, channeling tension into her character's analytical calm. Had the incidents happened on any other project, they might have passed as coincidence, but a film centered on psychic destruction invited interpretation. The line between thematic resonance and unnerving parallel blurred. The production pushed forward, but the day's events left a psychological imprint, and that lingering sense of fatalism would confront Ventura directly, shaping the most demanding aspect of his role. Fact 15. Lino Ventura carried the weight of rationality against a story built on chaos. As Inspector Brunel, Lino Ventura embodied the film's anchor, the rational mind attempting to decode the inexplicable. His performance required steadiness, skepticism, and emotional restraint, yet the conditions under which he worked challenged that stability. Ventura was accustomed to roles rooted in realism, where logic guided narrative. The Medusa Touch inverted that principle. He was tasked with confronting a threat that refused explanation, a consciousness whose destructive reach seemed to defy causality. Ventura often remarked that acting opposite Burton's immobile form demanded an unusual emotional posture. Instead of responding to another actor's expressions, he reacted to absence, an absence charged with hostility. He described it as speaking to a shadow that listens too intently. This psychological inversion wore on him. His scenes became exercises in holding tension without release. The cumulative effect of on-set incidents only added weight. Equipment failures during detective scenes, abrupt shifts in lighting, and the evacuation incident created an atmosphere Ventura could not entirely compartmentalize. He internalized this pressure, channeling it into Brunel's growing obsession. His line deliveries sharpened, his movements tightened, and his gaze took on a searching quality that reflected both character and actor grappling with forces just beyond reach. Crew members noticed that Ventura rarely broke character during shooting days. Between takes, he sat quietly reviewing notes, as though trying to impose order on a narrative built around disorder. Gold later credited Ventura with grounding the film emotionally without his steady presence. the story risked collapsing under its own dystopian implications. Ventura's struggle mirrored Brunel's, a man fighting to maintain coherence while the world around him tilted toward madness. And just as Brunel faced institutional resistance within the story, the production would soon face external pressure of its own from censors alarmed by the film's psychological intensity. Fact 16. Censors feared the film's tone more than its destruction. When the Medusa Touch reached British censors, they were prepared to scrutinize collapsing buildings, burning wreckage, and large-scale devastation. What they did not expect was to be disturbed by something far quieter, the film's emotional temperature. They noted that the violence was not sensationalized, yet it carried a cold intentionality, as if the disasters emerged from a worldview rather than a plot device. This unnerved them more than visible gore ever could. Several board members questioned whether the film implied that modern institutions were inherently vulnerable, a suggestion they felt might unsettle audiences already wary of infrastructure failures. They also expressed discomfort with Morlar's detachment, describing the character as a force masquerading as a man. The ambiguity surrounding his abilities, psychic or symbolic, made the story difficult to categorize, complicating the rating process. The cathedral collapse drew particular concern. Despite being miniature-based, the footage appeared distressingly authentic. One censor argued that the sequence risked being misinterpreted as documentation of a real disaster, potentially triggering public backlash. Studio executives braced for heavy edits, but Gold pushed back, insisting the scene's realism was essential to the narrative's psychological coherence. In the end, only minor trims were imposed, but the censors' response became part of the film's mythology. They were not objecting to excess, but to implication the sense that the story was whispering something about society's fragility. Their discomfort, ironically, amplified the film's aura. Instead of dampening interest, the controversy heightened curiosity, and as the film moved into public view, a new interpretation began forming, one that extended the narrative beyond fiction. Fact 17. Viewers started linking the film to real disasters, creating an urban legend. After the film's release, an unexpected phenomenon unfolded. Audiences began attributing predictive qualities to the story. Within months, newspaper letters and radio call-ins referenced eerie parallels between the film's fictional catastrophes and real-world events. A collapsed facade here, an aviation mishap there, an unexpected tremor unsettling a city. None of these incidents resembled Morlar's destruction in scale, yet the thematic resemblance fed public imagination. This wasn't the first time a film inspired prophetic speculation, but the Medusa Touch differed in tone. Its disasters felt brutally plausible, stripped of supernatural spectacle. The film presented destruction not as cosmic punishment, but as an extension of human bitterness. That framing made coincidences harder to dismiss. Psychologists suggested audiences were projecting anxieties of the era onto the film, using Morlar as a symbolic vessel. Fans, however, preferred supernatural explanations. Some debated whether Greenaway based the character on rumored psychics studied during Cold War research programs. Others speculated that Burton, known for intensity and volatility, brought an energy to the performance that blurred fiction and reality. Film critics fueled the conversation by publishing essays exploring whether cinema itself could prime viewers to notice patterns in the world. One critic wrote, "The film teaches you to spot fractures not just in structures, but in people." What began as fringe chatter transformed into an enduring urban legend. For a cult audience, Morlar became less a character than a concept, the embodiment of inevitable collapse. This evolving reputation set the stage for the film's revival, a resurgence driven not by theaters, but by the emerging power of home media. Fact 18. Television and VHS turned the film into a cult mystery. While its theatrical run was modest, the film's second life on television and VHS reshaped its legacy entirely. In late-night programming blocks, the movie acquired an atmospheric advantage. Its quiet pacing, clinical visuals, and bleak emotional tone resonated more deeply when viewed in dim living rooms or bedrooms, where isolation heightened the film's psychological edges. Many viewers discovered it accidentally switching channels, landing on the cathedral collapse, and staying to unravel the narrative's eerie logic. VHS widened the audience even further. Collectors praised its unusual blend of realism and fatalism, calling it a thinking person's supernatural thriller. Horror magazines featured it in lists of overlooked gems. noting how refreshingly restrained it felt compared to more sensational titles of the era. Rental shops reported consistent interest, particularly among fans seeking darker, quieter storytelling. Over time, the film's reputation grew into something mythic. Discussions in fan forums revolved around Morlar's true nature, the meaning of the final beep, and the symbolic weight of the disasters. Scholars analyzing Cold War anxieties began citing the film for its portrayal of internalized rage as a destabilizing force. Gold did not live to witness the film's full resurgence, but colleagues recalled his satisfaction that the movie found the hour it belonged to. And indeed, the film thrived in liminal spaces, late nights, worn tapes, whispered recommendations. Its survival proved that some stories do not need immediate acclaim. They need the right darkness, the right audience, and the right moment to be rediscovered. Fact 19. The final scene triggered decades of interpretation and debate. The film's closing moment, a faint pulse monitor beep cutting through clinical silence, became one of the most hotly debated endings in 1,970 seconds. Thriller cinema. It offered no explosion, no violent punctuation, no visual confirmation of what came next. Instead, it delivered a whisper. That restraint was intentional. Gold believed ambiguity held more terror than clarity. A threat undefined is a threat that lingers. Audiences, however, responded with fierce debate. Some believed the beep hinted at literal survival, framing Morlar as a nearly indestructible psychic force. Others insisted it symbolized ideological persistence, the continuation of destructive thinking long after the individual is gone. A smaller, more philosophical group interpreted the moment as commentary on institutional failure, that even when violence appears neutralized, the systems around it remain vulnerable. Film scholars revisited the scene repeatedly, noting how Gold positioned the camera to emphasize emptiness rather than revelation. There was no dramatic zoom, no sudden movement, only machinery reacting to something unseen. That lack of visual confirmation became the film's signature. Even years later, discussion boards, academic articles, and horror retrospectives circle back to the same question: what exactly survived in that room? The ambiguity gave the scene longevity. Because the answer is never provided, it can never be disproven. Morlar's influence becomes a matter of interpretation, not canon. The ending functions like a psychological trap, catching viewers in the space between belief and denial. This single moment transformed the Medusa Touch from a modest thriller into a cult obsession. But the film still held one more secret, a fragment of story almost no one knew existed. Fact 20. A deleted sequence revealed a more expansive, more disturbing vision. Hidden for decades in mislabeled storage, an unfinished sequence from the film offered a glimpse into an even bleaker interpretation of Morlar's power. The footage, discovered by archivists reviewing materials from a private estate, depicted investigators studying a series of small, simultaneous disturbances across London. None were catastrophic on their own: a localized blackout, a stalled metro car, a burst water main. Yet together, they implied a city subtly destabilizing. The scene, shot but never finalized with effects, suggested that Morlar's influence operated continuously rather than in isolated bursts triggered by emotion or memory. It was a chilling escalation, destruction no longer tied to personal anger, but emerging as an ambient, self-sustaining force. Gold ultimately refused to include the footage. He believed it over-explained the premise, drifting too far from the psychological ambiguity that defined the story. Revealing too much, he argued, would convert the film from an existential thriller into a straightforward narrative about telekinetic escalation. Crew members who viewed the raw footage described it as clinical dread, an almost documentary presentation of society cracking along invisible seams. One effects supervisor recalled feeling unsettled not by what was shown, but by what it implied, a world already unraveling, with Morlar merely catalyzing what was inevitable. Had the sequence been completed and included, the film's tone might have shifted dramatically. Instead of a story about a singular destructive consciousness, it would have hinted at a systemic collapse far beyond one man's mind. By removing the scene, Gold preserved the film's mystique, but its existence deepened the mythology surrounding the Medusa Touch, leaving fans to debate what the film might have become and whether the darker version would have revealed too much truth. Bonus fact: the lost footage that reframed Morlar's origin in a haunting way. For years, the production history of the Medusa Touch appeared straightforward. No competing cuts, no rumored alternates, no whispered stories of scenes buried by nervous executives. That illusion shattered when archivists cataloging material from a retired editor's estate uncovered a damaged canister labeled simply Morlar, early. Inside was a fragment of film depicting a childhood sequence far more unsettling than anything included in the final version. The footage opens on a desolate schoolyard, scorched and empty, with smoke drifting across the frame like breath that refuses to dissipate. A young boy, unmistakably an early Morlar, stands alone amid the wreckage. Children cry off-screen, teachers scramble in panic, yet the boy's expression is serene, almost contemplative, as if the devastation around him were an expected outcome rather than a tragedy. The shot lingers long enough to make viewers uncomfortable, too long for accident, too deliberate for ambiguity. What makes the footage particularly startling is how it reframes the character's psychology. In the released film, Morlar's destructive capacity appears tied to adult rage, trauma, and misanthropy. The deleted sequence implies something far more disturbing, a formative affinity with ruin, a comfort in environments where order has dissolved. If this interpretation had survived into the final cut, Morlar would appear less as a man overwhelmed by internal violence and more as someone fundamentally shaped by it from childhood. Crew notes found with the reel reveal Gold's reasoning for its removal. He feared the scene robbed the story of its ambiguity, pushing Morlar from psychologically complex to demonically predetermined. Gold believed the terror of the film lay in uncertainty, the possibility that catastrophe might grow from emotional wounds rather than supernatural gifts. Yet, the fragment continues to fascinate those who have seen it. It poses a provocative question: was Morlar the architect of destruction, or merely its earliest witness? The footage offers no answer, only a lingering discomfort, the kind that theater lights cannot dispel. The shadows around the Medusa Touch don't fade with time, they deepen, reshaping the way each scene feels long after the credits end. If one fact stayed with you more than the others, tell us why. Was it a coincidence, an artistic choice, or something the film never fully revealed? Your perspective might expose another hidden layer in this strange and unsettling story. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know which film or mystery you want us to unravel next. Join us again for more stories that wait quietly in the dark.